Over the last 3 decades, there have been numerous documentaries and there's been extensive coverage on today's story. So there's not much that I could say that hasn't already been said about what happened. But even so, there are a lot of people that don't know about it. And even when they do, sometimes we tend to forget where this all started, with the last moments of a 7-year-old boy. While I do have to touch on the riots, today's video is mostly about the families involved, what life was like before all this happened, and the aftermath of it all. I do have to warn that today's video contains details of the last moments of a child and racial tensions throughout the years in New York City. So before jumping in, please do keep that in mind. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. What you're watching right now is a scene from an episode of the original Law & Order called Sanctuary, released in 1994. The plot of the episode centers around a child whose life is taken when he's hit by a car, and the person behind the wheel leaves the scene. The man driving, who's said to be Jewish, is caught by a mob of angry residents in Harlem, and it all leads to more tragedy when his life is also taken. Now, this episode of Law & Order is one that I'll never forget. If you grew up in or around Douglas, you might remember the day this episode was shot. I know I definitely do. This episode was filmed all around the Douglas houses, and this riot scene was directly behind 830 Amsterdam Avenue, where I lived at the time. I'll never forget waking up to the sounds of people screaming and my uncle swearing that someone was truly being brutally attacked. And once the mob dispersed, it was clear that this was just a show or a movie being filmed. When I came back from school later that day is when I found out that Law & Order was that show. Everyone was talking about it, and we all tuned in when it aired a few weeks later. If some of what you just saw and heard in these clips sounds familiar, it's because, like a lot of episodes of Law & Order, the plot of this episode was inspired by true events that took place in 1991. Except the riots depicted in this episode didn't take place in Harlem like they did on the show. They took place in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, New York, unfolding after an innocent child's life was ended in what felt like the blink of an eye, and it would lead to another innocent life being taken just a few hours later. The violence and outrage that followed for days after would come to be known as one of the darkest moments this city's ever witnessed. On today's episode of Evil Intentions, this is Boiling Point, the story of Gavin Cato.
On fire. The looting, rioting, and violence that started on the night of August 19th, 1991. For the last 30 years, the images of Gavin Cato and Yankel Rosenbaum have continued to haunt the city.
Gavin Cato was born on November 24th of 1983 and resided in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, New York. He was born to his mother, Ingrid Walcott, and his father, Carmel Cato. He had 6 siblings, and the family hailed from Guyana. Carmel, son Gavin, and other members of the family would make their way to New York City in November of 1990, where they would settle down in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn. Carmel had been to the States years prior, but this would be his first time returning with Gavin. It was a huge change from being back home, but life in the States offered different opportunities for the family, so they could thrive and make a living. Carmel would find work in construction, which provided him the opportunity to send money back home. He was working hard and saving as much as possible, so he could eventually help Gavin's mother make her way to the city. She stood back home in Guyana while the father and son made the trip. Dating back as far as the 60s, Crown Heights was a population consisting of different cultures, faces of many backgrounds. From the Chabad Lubavitch Jews who fled Europe back in the 40s and relocated to Crown Heights, to families like the Catos. As poverty and crime took a hold of the city, Crown Heights would be one of the many areas in New York that felt the impact directly, as families just tried to do what they could to make ends meet. Those times had their fair share of racial tensions, just like other parts of the city, but many of the families also coexisted without problems. This was now Gavin's new home. It was a lot different from Guyana, but it was a new way of life, one that he and the family would quickly adjust to. In the summer of 1991, Gavin would attend a primary program at PS 221 in Crown Heights, where he would begin to flourish and make many friends. Like a lot of other kids his age, he was just full of life and beginning to shine more and more in the city that he now called home. He was described by his father as a kind, loving 7-year-old, a child who had his whole life ahead of him and was always up for trying new things and making new friends. His father stated he was, quote, quiet and thoughtful, one of his best children. There was a lot that could influence a child Gavin's age, and not all of it was positive, so his father always watched his son closely and made sure he stood on the right path. Not always an easy feat for a parent, especially back then and in a place like New York City. Carmel's approach worked, and Gavin was growing up to be a focused kid. He was described by teachers at PS 221 as a boy full of energy, always very playful during his time at the summer program that he attended, and always known for his big smile. A child who loved to draw and easily made new friends in class. It was said that whenever he wrote his name on his schoolwork, his face would light up, as if he was proud of branding his work with his family's name. Aside from making many friends, Gavin also spent a lot of time in school with his cousin Angela. Her father, Carmel's brother, had joined them in moving from Guyana to Brooklyn, making the adjustment a bit easier. Gavin and Angela were always together, every single day. It was stated that while Gavin was the more active and playful of the two, Angela had more of a dominant personality, able to calm Gavin down if he was a little too active in class or during activities. They shared a very special kind of bond since birth, with the children being born only 6 hours apart. They were the best of friends, described by Carmel as more like twins. The summer of 1991 was their first ever in the States. They would spend their days riding bike all around the neighborhood, making their way through the diverse communities, a whole different world to explore at every turn. They were enjoying every last bit of their childhood, but even at the young age of 7 years old, they knew exactly what kind of future they wanted for themselves. Gavin spoke of wanting to become a lawyer when he grew up. Angela talked about becoming a nurse. Their parents were happy to hear about the dreams they had in mind. It was a huge part of the reason they made their way to the States to begin with. The best interests of their children were always a priority. Like so many others who made the long journey from their countries to New York City, they worked hard to give their kids opportunities that they themselves didn't have back home when they were growing up. Hearing the kids talk about their futures in such a positive light made their parents very proud. It was a pleasant reminder that the relocation was well worth it, and their hard work was paying off. The future was looking very promising for the children, and they were looking forward to soon becoming second graders. But in August of 1991, this family would find themselves at the center of a heartbreaking tragedy, one that started on President Street, an evening that would change everything for residents of Crown Heights. July into August of 1991 would see temperatures soar as high as 102 degrees, with New Yorkers in all 5 boroughs feeling the worst of that summer's first heat wave. The extreme heat did very little to slow the children down. They were still as active as ever. The day was August 19th. As temperatures cooled and the summer was approaching its end, they did what they always did. They took out their bikes, went to the front, and prepared to ride up and down the street, with their fathers watching them close by. Plenty of people still outside on a warm summer night like this. Before going for that ride, Gavin realized that the chain to his bike had become detached, so he stopped to fix it. Angela was right there, next to him, like she always was. According to reports, at around 8:20 p.m., a motorcade of 3 cars escorted by police made their way through the intersection of President Street and Utica Ave. The last car in that motorcade, a station wagon, seemed to fall behind, picking up speed to catch up with the rest. It was driven by a 22-year-old rabbinical student from Israel named Yosef Lifsh. As he sped up, it was stated that he was going much faster than the speed limit, going through the traffic light as it changed from yellow to red. The station wagon collided with a vehicle making its way down Utica Ave, quickly jumping the curb right after, crashing right into Angela and Gavin, crushing them. The sound of the car crashing into the trash cans and building created what sounded like an explosion, as cries could be heard from onlookers and from beneath the vehicle. Gavin's father, who stood outside watching his son, saw as the car lost control driving down the street. But it all happened so fast that there was no way for him to intervene or warn the children. He knew the car crashed exactly into the spot the kids were playing. He could hear Angela's cries for help as she lay pinned beneath the vehicle, but he didn't hear Gavin. He rushed over as fast as he could, trying with all his might to move the car or shift the weight off the children to see if they were still alive, but it was nearly impossible. Within seconds, others who had seen everything unfold were helping lift the car to save the children. By 8:21 p.m., a call was made to 911 about someone pinned under a vehicle after a crash. By 8:22 p.m., NYPD and EMS vehicles were dispatched to the scene. As the children laid on the ground helpless, emotions ran high, and the reckless driving seen by many would spark outrage, as it was clear that 2 innocent children were critically hurt. A minute later, at 8:23 p.m., a call came into 911 about a large fight at the same location. When police arrived, they would find that a big crowd had gathered, and according to them, some of those in the crowd were scuffling with Lifsh, who had been driving the car. While there were different versions of what transpired after this, the end result was chaos. According to police and EMS, it was said that when they arrived on the scene, a volunteer ambulance servicing Jewish communities by the name of Hatzolah was already there. But according to Hatzolah, when they arrived, EMS and police were there at about the same time, maybe a few seconds earlier. They said that one of the Hatzolah ambulance crew got out of their vehicle and shouted, "Where is the child?" But they were told by police that EMS was already helping the children. But this was entirely different from what others say they witnessed. A man who worked at a restaurant near the scene said he heard when the speeding vehicle crashed. He immediately ran outside to see what it was and saw when the Hatzolah ambulance arrived. He said there didn't seem to be any interest in helping the children. They seemed more concerned with getting Lifsh, the now injured driver, out of the area. It was stated that they were trying to get Lifsh away from the crowd because that's what they were told to do by a police officer, since EMS was already working on helping the kids. There were many different accounts of what happened, and it was unclear which was accurate. But as emotions ran high, and as police tried to get the crowd to disperse, according to witnesses, including Carmel, Gavin and Angela were still on the floor. Many would look on as they watched the Hatzolah ambulance leave the scene without the children. This would lead many to believe that they left the kids on purpose. It would be minutes later, at 8:28 p.m., when a second EMS vehicle would arrive in the middle of a growing crowd and took Gavin to Kings County Hospital, while the first set of EMS workers worked on Angela. It all happened in just a few minutes. Angela, whose right leg was crushed, was taken to the hospital soon after. She would barely make it out of the crash alive. She escaped with bruises over most of her body, lacerations, burns from when her body was dragged by the station wagon, and a nearly severed tongue. But 7-year-old Gavin Cato had sustained blunt force injuries to the head and body from when he was crushed, injuries far too devastating for his small body. Doctors stated that the speed and impact of the crash, combined with the weight of the car, would have taken his life immediately. Gavin Cato was gone. The news shattered his loved ones, especially his father, who was right there to see it happen, without any ability to stop it or give warning. It was a moment that would play in his mind over and over in the hours that followed. When doctors told Carmel that his son was gone, it didn't feel real. All he wanted to hear was that Gavin was going to be okay. This was an accident. How could he be dead? Why would this happen? Questions any grieving parent would find themselves struggling with. Now came the family's next challenge, making calls to loved ones back home to let them know what happened. And while they fought through the very start of what would be a very long grieving process, within hours of the accident, the streets of Crown Heights were becoming a war zone. It started between 11:15 and 11:25 p.m. when a large group of men came across a man named Yankel Rosenbaum as he walked along Kingston Ave and Union Street. He was a 29-year-old Jewish man from Melbourne, Australia, a student visiting New York City to study the Holocaust, which his father survived. He was described by his brother as kind and loving, someone who would do whatever he could to avoid a violent situation, more of a peacemaker. According to witnesses, the words, "Get him, get the Jew," could be heard, and in moments, the mob was chasing and attacking Rosenbaum. As he was beaten down, he would also be stabbed a total of 4 times, and in the struggle would crack his skull on the pavement as he took the beating. He was taken to Kings County Hospital, where he was still conscious for some time. He asked why this was done to him as he lay bleeding. Authorities stated that Rosenbaum was able to identify the person that stabbed him, but what they weren't aware of was that Yankel was still bleeding profusely, even at the hospital, because doctors failed to detect one of his stab wounds. He held on as best as he could, but with that stab wound still bleeding out, he would be pronounced dead a few hours later at 2 a.m. He had absolutely no connection to the accident that took Gavin's life just hours prior. Within just a few hours, there were now 2 innocent victims, a child and a man who tragically and unexpectedly lost their lives. The chaos that followed for days after would leave the entire city rattled and would be spoken about for decades to come. After Gavin and Yankel lost their lives, tensions erupted and rumors were continuing to spread. Some stated the driver of the station wagon was drunk. Others said he did it on purpose. Some felt that this was bound to happen due to a past of racial issues within the community. Then there were many who just wanted to see everyone coexist without hatred or violence. The footage you just saw is the aftermath of what took place that evening. 4 days of rioting. Many expressed their feelings of not enough being done to stop the riot sooner. Others said you couldn't compare Gavin's death, which was an accident, to Yankel's death, which was a targeted anti-Semitic attack committed as revenge. Residents also expressed that much of the rioting was done by people who weren't actually from the neighborhood, but coming in to take part in it.
This situation, because it's not most of the people in the neighborhood, it's people from outside of the neighborhood. People in the neighborhood don't have any problems. As a matter of fact, I live a block away and I didn't even know this incident took place for 2 hours. Then I seen a lot of kids running up and down the street and that's what's happening. That's how I found out.
So you think the police should leave, the mayor shouldn't come back here, Al Sharpton shouldn't be here? Is that who you're talking about?
No, police definitely shouldn't leave. Without the police, this thing would be ridiculous. I think the police ought to calm it, cool it down, do whatever they have to do.
Live in the neighborhood 36 years.
Why do you think there's been trouble the last 3 nights in this general vicinity?
It's the outsiders that are here to instigate and to provoke demonstrations and problems to bring out their cause. It has nothing to do with our immediate neighborhoods. Our neighborhood is safe, sound. We live in harmony with the blacks. The blacks live in harmony with us. You can ask our neighbors. You go to the parks, you'll see baseball games with black kids, with Hasidic kids playing together. Brooklyn Children's Museum, you will see black kids with the Jewish kids doing activities together. We have the nicest harmony. This is an example for the whole world to see how we are integrated.
At the end of it all, after the riots were over, after arrests were made, there were still 2 innocent people who weren't here anymore, and their families would barely even have the chance to properly grieve. The riots, the countless articles in papers, and widespread coverage of all the violence that followed would overshadow those that this all started with. While the rest of the country watched the updates from the comfort of their homes on the evening news, that wasn't the case for those who resided in Crown Heights. There was still very much a surreal and tense cloud that loomed over the area. The last few days of violence in a place that many felt safe before all this occurred was hard to ignore or forget. But worst of all, these two families were about to experience one of the hardest and heartbreaking moments that they would ever face, laying their loved ones to rest. On Monday, August 26th of 1991, exactly a week after his death and after the riots died down, a service was held for Gavin Cato at St. Anthony's Church in Brooklyn. More than 2,000 people would attend to pay their respects to he and his family. Gavin's mother, who had only arrived in New York City days prior for the service, could be heard wailing, tears running down her face. She always knew that one day soon she would be on her way to the city to be reunited with her son. She just never thought that it would be for a tragedy such as this. The distraught mother had to be helped to her seat. The overwhelming grief was almost too much to take. Those around her would try everything they could to console her, but it wouldn't be easy. Others who heard her cries couldn't help but break down themselves, as everyone in the church was reminded of where this all started. Angela, who was still seriously injured, remained in the hospital and wouldn't be able to attend the service. She would be released from the hospital later on September 19th of 1991. Members of the community came together to support this family and show that they understood their pain. The loss was unbearable. Visitors approached Gavin's small white coffin, where he could be seen laying inside, wearing a navy blue suit, a light blue shirt with a white bow tie. Cries for justice could be heard all throughout the church as the anger continued to build up, since the driver responsible for the child's sudden death hadn't yet been arrested or charged with anything. It seemed to be an accident, but even so, they felt the crime was committed when he left the scene. They felt that reckless drivers often got charged for much less, so why not here? There was a mix of emotions all throughout the service: sadness, anguish, anger, outrage, and disappointment. The family felt all of the above. Words of comfort were delivered by many who took to the podium, paired with talks of demanding justice. Many continued to express that something like this was bound to happen because the city had a history of similar tragedies that caused major racial tensions years before this, all racially motivated hate crimes. Incidents like when 34-year-old Willie Turks was targeted and attacked by a group of white men, leading to his death, or Howard Beach in 1986 when 23-year-old Michael Griffith and his friends were attacked by a group of white teens, leading to Griffith being struck and killed by a driver as he tried to get away. Or years later in 1989 when 16-year-old Yusuf Hawkins was slain in cold blood after being attacked in the predominantly Italian neighborhood of Bensonhurst. Some residents in the Crown Heights neighborhood also expressed racial tensions for years before things reached their boiling point in 1991. The situations in the other areas of Brooklyn and Queens were different from Gavin's, but it would leave these neighborhoods with a sense of uncertainty looming over them, with many asking themselves, where do we go from here? What's going to happen next? After the service, things were still very tense, and there were minor scuffles between attendees and police, but it mostly went without problems. There were no arrests. Gavin's small casket was carried into a hearse to be driven to Cypress Hill Cemetery, where he would be buried. More than 1,000 people took to the streets after the service, walking almost 5 miles to the cemetery. As they walked, chants of "No Justice, No Peace" and "Remember Gavin Cato" could be heard all throughout the neighborhoods. He was laid to rest before his loved ones, with the promise that his name would never be forgotten. On Wednesday, August 21st of 1991, a funeral procession was held for Yankel Rosenbaum. During the service, his coffin was carried through the streets of Crown Heights as thousands grieved. His procession was held as the riots were still going on. The feelings here weren't much different. There was a profound sense of loss and sadness. Yankel was another innocent victim, targeted for being a Jewish man. He had no connection at all to the incident that took place hours prior, but he would suffer a cruel fate regardless. The Jewish community also demanded justice for this, and it was clear that the pain was being felt on both sides. Yankel's distraught family would organize for his body to be flown back home to Australia after his service. He would be laid to rest at Springvale Cemetery in Noble Park, Australia. After Gavin and Yankel were laid to rest, the tension in Crown Heights remained for a very long time. Joseph Lipsch, who drove the station wagon that killed Gavin Cato and left the scene, had left the country soon after the accident. He didn't contact Gavin's family and hadn't publicly expressed remorse for what happened, but he was said to be remorseful as he spoke to a grand jury. They decided he wouldn't face any charges for the accident or for fleeing. It was determined that no crime was committed. The decision only made matters worse, as many felt he had to be held responsible for leaving and for the reckless driving in general. Another hurdle in a family's quest for some sort of justice, one that wouldn't end anytime soon. On Tuesday, August 27th of 1991, 16-year-old Lemrick Nelson was charged with second-degree murder for the stabbing of Yankel Rosenbaum. It was he who Rosenbaum identified before he bled out and died at the hospital. Authorities also stated that he confessed to the crime, although Nelson's lawyer expressed that he was being framed. Despite police finding a bloody knife in Nelson's pocket and the blood matching Rosenbaum's blood type, he was acquitted. This would spark outrage in the Jewish community of Crown Heights, as the evidence was clear, and this was a revenge attack on someone just for being Jewish. After the acquittal, a new investigation was ordered, and in August of 1994, Nelson was arrested again on charges that he violated Yankel's civil rights. He would later go on to admit that he did stab Yankel, but not because he was Jewish. It was because he had too much to drink and did it randomly. He would serve time in prison as different trials were had and charges were overturned. He was released from federal prison in June of 2004. Others who took part in the beating of Yankel Rosenbaum were never identified. On Wednesday, August 14th of 1996, a man named Charles Price was arrested and charged on federal civil rights charges after a 5-year-old videotape surfaced which showed the moments after the crash before the chaos began. The video was said to show him inciting the violence that would soon set off 4 days of rioting. He was convicted on February 10th of 1997 and released from prison in November of 2009. Angela Cato, who had a long recovery ahead of her after all this unfolded, would suffer from nightmares for years after. Thoughts of her cousin's final moments and her almost losing her life would frequently pop up in her head. It left her traumatized for some time, leaving her with an overwhelming fear that she would be hit by a car again. She was just a child when it all happened, but she was well aware of the gravity of it all. She saw the news. She could feel the change in the air. That unsettling feeling in a place she was just starting to call home. One moment, she was just a child riding around with her cousin, happy and looking forward to the future. The next, she was at the center of all this turmoil, and her best friend in the world was no longer by her side. It's hard to imagine the effect that this had on her. It was something many had lost sight of. Her scars from the accident were a reminder of that evening, a night she wouldn't soon forget. But she remained resilient through every bit of it, visiting Gavin's grave and attending vigils held for him in the neighborhood in the years after his passing, always keeping his memory close to her heart. A decade after Gavin Cato and Yankel Rosenbaum were killed, Carmel Cato and Norman Rosenbaum, Yankel's brother, would meet, and it was the start of a long and positive friendship. This would be after Carmel reached out. They chose to listen and understand one another. They wanted to show that there could be peace within the community, to show that the actions carried out by a few on both sides didn't speak for everyone. The two would meet up over the years, taking time to support one another before grieving separately for their loved ones. Carmel would remember Gavin for his kind, loving ways, while Norman would remember his brother Yankel for his dry sense of humor, something he missed dearly about him. He also remembered how Yankel said he wanted to make a difference. Norman would say the following: "In hindsight, what he said was very insightful. We can all make a difference." Carmel had the following to say about his relationship with Norman: "As a father, I wanted to see things better, for the world to see that I was African American and he was Jewish, and show we could get along." The two would remain in contact via email and phone calls, with Carmel even planning to one day visit Norman in his native Australia. Unfortunately, Norman Rosenbaum would pass away in July of 2020 at the age of 63 years old. For years and years after the riots unfolded, questions remained in the community. Everyone knew it would be a long while before things would even begin to return to normal, but with time, it became easier. Different communities once again coexisting, everyone crossing paths with no problems, but this time with a certain understanding of the past. Of course, like in a lot of communities all over, things may not be perfect. There will always be issues, but what's important is what's been learned from the past and how to stop it from ever happening again. Whether it be talks about the police not doing enough during the riots, to criticism of the mayor, to the charges against all those involved, the evening of August 19th, 1991, and everything that took place after is still remembered and spoken about today. Beyond the looting, the violence, and the uncertainty were two families who had loved ones ripped away from them without warning. They were hurting in a way that a lot of us will never understand, and they were just trying to find their way to closure. For them, they never forgot where all this began. It started with the innocent and loving boy who once rode his bike up and down the streets of Crown Heights, the bright child with plans of someday becoming a successful lawyer, unaware that a tragic accident would claim his life before he ever had the chance. It started with the peaceful, loving man walking down the street in Crown Heights, unaware that he would be targeted and paid with his life for something he had no part in. Two different people from different backgrounds, different age groups, totally different worlds, but both of their names forever tied to the chaos that followed. While a lot has changed for the better since then, it's unfortunate that any of this ever happened at all. If alive today, Gavin would be 41 and Yankel would be 62 years old. Rest in peace, Gavin Cato and Yankel Rosenbaum, and my deepest condolences go out to their families and loved ones. You aren't forgotten.
A traffic accident that resulted in the death of one 7-year-old child. His name is Gavin Cato.